Okay, so our topic for this week is what is the connection between problem solving and innovation and freedom of speech? Take it away, Rich.
Right, thank you. So there's actually a very important connection between the two, which may not appear obvious straight away. So in order to think freely, you need to be able to speak clearly and freely, because your ability to articulate your thoughts is what comes out of speech. And the wider your vocabulary is, and the more agility you have in being able to express your thoughts, the more you're able to bring them together to do something practical with them. So freedom of speech is really freedom of thought.
Okay.
And whenever we've seen attempts to control speech, then it makes sense that that's an attempt to control thought as well. When I think about the kind of most extreme examples of this, then I think of what George Orwell did with 1984. And in that he has the government who's in power create a thing called newspeak. And newspeak is an attempt to limit vocabulary along the lines of its ideology that they wish to promote. And the ultimate aim of newspeak is to ever more decrease the amount of vocabulary that's available, so that people are unable to express differing views and therefore think in different ways as well. So if you like, the ultimate enemy would be anything that tries to do something like a newspeak and impose a way of thinking, limit vocabulary, limit your thought process in order to promote a certain ideology.
Okay.
So you follow me so far?
I'm following.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, let's explain that a little bit further then. So if you imagine in the medieval Europe, there was a very strong theocracy.
Okay.
In other words, the church, and in this case the Roman Catholic Church in Europe, had an ideology, and it didn't want to have people thinking more freely than that. Because if you forget about religion for a moment and think about it only in terms of keeping hold of power, they were able to influence people's thought by influencing their speech, which enabled them to remain in power. And anybody who, with, let's say, logic or reason, wanted to object to the dogmatic approach that they were teaching, dogma being another form of effectively ideology, then they would just call that person a heretic. Now, if you want to call it a cleverness, you can do. But that's clever because you don't have to then explain it any further than that. You can just label that person as a heretic. You don't have to debate the points that they were trying to make or deal with their thought processes. You just say, that's against dogma, it is a heresy. You are a heretic. And in that case, you would have been killed. So yeah, it's pretty extreme.
It's a straight red, right?
It's a straight red card, yeah, exactly. Okay. And what that does is it limits people's ability to think freely, which was the last thing in many cases they wanted. Or if they did, they only wanted people to think in a very limited boundary. This to me is the essential difference between philosophy and theology. In that philosophy and science, because after all science was originally called natural philosophy, it's an attempt to find the truth, sometimes by discourse, by debate, by experiment, without the boundary that you place it in. Whereas theology, let's say, for example, we take Christian theology, it's almost that you assume that you already know the answers. But within that box, within those limitations that they've been set, then you can think freely. But you're within a box of assumptions, effectively. And if we want to characterize a dogma or an ideology in any way, it can be that it is a set of assumptions. It isn't fact. It's something that we have assumed to be the case. And that's why for problem solving and innovation, it's so important to be able to challenge that and speak and think clearly. You're not always going to be right, but you need to have at least the freedom to be wrong. Because if you've got a set of assumptions, they need to be challenged. Because if you're not challenging the assumption, then you're not going to create anything different, anything new, and anything potentially that could benefit people.
How does that translate to today? Kind of examples that we can use in present day?
Well, let's not be afraid to take the bull by the horns, John. on this, accepting that there will be, because of the ideological environment that we live in, there will be detractors as soon as you even mention something like this. But let's not be afraid at the risk of them taking this off YouTube and whatever, because we can explain it logically, and we can say, well, there are certain things that are in the air which are dogma. I'm going to use an example. I've got a friend who is a very caring individual. He's the kind of person that buys socks for homeless people. Now, the point about that is he doesn't just give them money. He's thought about it. He's thought, well, what would I need? You know, it's a sign of empathy. What would I need maybe if I was on the streets that other people may not be buying me? I can see people supplying you with food. I can see people giving you money. But here's probably a good choice. They haven't got socks, and foot health is a huge thing. Okay. So he's really carefully thought about that. So if I'm painting a picture of this person as a compassionate, empathetic individual, then to me that's correct. That's how he strikes me. He said to me on one occasion, I've just been having a look at the suicide rates for transgender people, both pre-op and post-op, and they are unbelievably high. Now, he was saying this out of concern for other human beings. And he said, maybe it might be a case that the desire to want to change your gender is a type of body dysmorphia, like anorexia or bigorexia that some bodybuilders get. Now, I don't know the truth, and he wasn't saying he knew the truth either. He wasn't saying this is a definite. He was saying, here is something for consideration, because it cannot be right that as a society we are not helping people and they're committing suicide. This can't be right. So never mind if the issue is transgender or anything. The point is that some human beings are killing themselves, and he would suggest, as I would, that is not a good thing. So maybe it might be a case that they are better off, rather than being encouraged to have surgery, than being treated as if it's a mental health problem. Now, as I say again, I do not know what the truth of that is. It might be nonsense. It might be right. But there's a real problem if you're going to try and shut that argument down by saying you are being transphobic. Because the intent of that conversation is to try and solve the problem of people killing themselves, which is obviously, to me, a virtuous thing to be doing. To be able to have that discussion and not be shut down by somebody saying, no, you're a transphobe. Because as soon as they do that, they no longer need to engage with the logic and reason that you're using. Now, if somebody was to say, well, I've taken the way that you've viewed those statistics, or first of all, maybe I don't agree with the statistics, maybe they're wrong, or this might have some weight except this, this and this. You might say, for example, that the high level of suicide might be due to societal persecution and a feeling of alienation. Or you might be saying maybe it's a mix of those elements. But to be able to have the conversation without having your vocabulary shut down and your thoughts shut down is incredibly important. Because that's almost like a modern form of what the church did with calling people heretics. We don't need to engage with your logic and reason anymore. All we're going to do is call you a label, and that label might be a transphobe. You know, if you were talking about nuanced problems with Islamic extremists, you're an Islamophobe. You know, if it's to do with women's rights, it might be a misogynist or a sexist, or you get the idea that the applying of simple labels to things which are often nuanced and complex problems doesn't help you come up with new innovative solutions to be able to make everyone's lives better. Right. We can draw that across and say the same is true with every problem, that if you come into an environment and there's an accepted way of speaking, maybe even a technical language, which limits your ability to go beyond those boundaries, then you need to question the language that's being used first of all in order that you can articulate maybe a new and novel solution to the problem. This is why people throughout history have decided to make their own words up. If there isn't a word that's perhaps doing what it should be in increasing your ability to express your thoughts.
Right. So we run the risk of reducing our freedom of speech, essentially.
Yeah, well, to be fair, I mean, we don't really have straightforward freedom of speech in this country because we have hate speech. The legislation behind hate speech. Now, before anybody goes bananas, when that was brought in, I think a lot of people felt, well, I'm, maybe a Muslim or have Muslim friends. I don't really want people having a go at them for their beliefs. And that seems to be a completely sensible thing, reasonable thing. You know, I've got friends of different colours, white, white, black, brown, whatever. I don't want anyone having a go at them for the colour of their skin. Again, this is a reasonable thing to think. But instead, what happens when you start limiting this through legislation, we have the completely daft example where somebody in Scotland becomes convicted for telling a joke when the intent of the joke was to show, in this case, that Nazis were the least cute thing that there could be.
Right.
I'm talking about the individual who I believe is called a shit poster,
Right.
which is a bit of vocabulary that I learned recently.
Right.
And his girlfriend had this dog, this pug, and because she felt that it was really cute, as a kind of mischievous thing to do, he wanted it to turn it into the least cute thing he could think of, which was a Nazi. I think we'd probably both agree that Nazis aren't cute. And in doing this process, he taught it to do a Nazi salute. And he was actually convicted in Scotland, convicted of hate speech.
Right.
When his intention clearly was not to somehow say, oh, that Hitler, he's got good ideas, hasn't he? And it was the exact opposite. So this is why legislation is a very, very bad idea, because it never seems to stick with what the original intention was. There's always an ability for it to become, zealous. And when I think about zealous in the medieval example, you've got the Spanish Inquisition. Now, if you want a zealous persecution of what they thought were heretics, then you've got that. Because as soon as you depersonalise, dehumanize somebody by calling them a label like a heretic, then apparently you can do what you like to them. And that is a real danger that we face when it comes to the innovation and problem solving. And it's something we need to be very, very careful of. I am not surprised that in America they take that freedom of speech very, very seriously. There's another tendency that we have, and that's to attack the person's right to say something. And that's a very interesting thing, because somebody might say, well, why do you have a right to say that? Well, we all have a right to say it. That's kind of the point of why people like my grandfather's generation and millions of people like him fought for the freedom. It's the freedom to be able to have people's opinions that you don't agree with. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we would be having this conversation auf Deutsch rather than in English, right? So that is, you have a right to say these things because we have had to fight for it as a country and as a society. Right. And that right needs to be exercised, even if you do not agree with what that person is saying. It's the idea of, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'll preserve your right to say it, with my life, because that's probably what makes a better society where we can come up with good solutions to things. We may be wrong. Our assumptions, our ideological assumptions may be wrong, but language and discourse can challenge that if we have the right to say what we want to say and what we believe in. Maybe we don't believe in that same thing 10 years later. But at the time when you believe it, and if you state it, then that opens it up to being challenged. And that's the kind of conversation that we need to help people's innovation, problem solving, and general freedom of thought.